MicroGrid units that are on the grid already that are used for load shedding to actually enhance the system during storms, et cetera, to be able to isolate and run parts of the grid in the case that we lose transmission and or parts of the system are down because of trees or storms, et cetera. So we will do some hardening, but most of it will be remote switches that will be controlled through SCADA that will allow us to isolate and control the power to the generators in a systematic way. So what we have here in front of you, and I'll pass these around after, you can come up and look at them afterwards. This is what we call the West microgrid. There are 2 generators. They are actually down here on Bridge Street, right here. And what we propose to feed is down Eastern Point Road, the PAF, which is city-owned PAF, which is Waste Treatment Center, and then all the way down Eastern Point Road to Hess, which is Buckeye, I guess. That would be a potential fuel supply for the diesel generators. So at Bridge Street, we have 2.5 megawatt diesel generators. Those we're working on the plan right now at Schneider Electric. They've been selected as the engineering group, the EPC, the Engineering, Procurement, and Construction Group, to design and figure out where the loads are and whether or not we can sustain these loads. So coming up here is Bucquonic Road up to the 5 Corners. There's a Cumberland Farms. There's a gas station here, Charter Oak Federal Credit Union. This would proceed down past Buford's, go down West Street, and that would actually feed the city municipal building. On this end of the grid, this would go down, I think it's Military Highway or River Road right here in the front.
Yeah. Military Highway.
This is a corner section of Grove. It would go up Grove. It would proceed down near Pleasant Valley Substation, which is a substation down on that side of town on the north side of 95. It would proceed across the street to the Stop and Shop Plaza, so that grocery store and that plaza would be fed. It would go off the backside and feed Walmart, and then it would go across the street and feed the hotel series over there. You've got Groton Motor Inn, Ramada, and then we added a section recently per the town's request to pick up Hilton Gardens. So that would allow on this side of town to feed essentially the Hess Depot, which would allow us to get fuel for the microgrid. I mean, what we're looking at potentially, and I don't know how much you know about what's happened in the last, we had Irene, we had Sandy. We were probably up within 2 to 3 days. Out of 12,000 customers in Groton Utilities area, 12,700, 8,000 to 9,000 customers were out of power for a period of 2 to 3 days, maybe longer. In about 4 days, 4.5 days, we had everyone restored in both storms. That was probably a mild storm. That was a level 1, possibly 1.5, almost 2. If we had a 3 or a 4, we might not have power back for weeks. That's the concern, is that future storms could be worse, and they're talking about global warming, it's going away, global warming, this and that, but there could be a cyber attack. Transmission lines could go down, Millstone could have an issue. If Millstone goes down, we're most likely going to lose power here. And the concern is that we wouldn't be able to power and sustain the community. So that's what this is trying to help with. That's the west side, so that's near the river.
So can I ask?
Sure, yes.
My first question is a simple question. What does 2.5 megawatts mean?
So 2.5 megawatts is the size of the generator.
Yeah, I know that, but
Right.
what does that give power to? How many people or
Right.
whatever?
So what they're saying is, so that would be 5 megawatts total for this generation. What they're looking at is any residual loads along the ends. It would be residentials and businesses along these pathways.
Mm-hmm.
It would be there's probably 200 residents and businesses along this total.
EB is part of that too, right? I mean,
Yeah, so EB is fed at a different voltage. This would be the 13,800 volt circuit, which is residentials, businesses, three-phase
Okay.
businesses. The PAF EB is fed at 34,000
right.
volts, and so we're not touching that part of the grid. Those businesses would be essentially on their own, and they'd have to sustain. I think Pfizer's working out something with, local partners at ships, et cetera, but they'd have to sustain their own businesses, et cetera. But so this would be residential and businesses only at the 13,800 volt level. And what Schneider's doing is they're looking at the potential for how many customers we can run. Depending on the loads here, if it's, say it's 2.3 megawatts on a 2 megawatt generator, and we run both generators, now we can sustain that load longer. And that's the idea, is to be able to sustain the loads for 5 to 7 days, potentially go up to 21 days with refueling, et cetera. So that's what Schneider's looking at as an engineering firm, and we're going to try and maximize the use of this grid and what the loads are. So this is the proposed path, mostly because of Hess and Buckeye, and then certainly to come up here, I guess that the Cumberland Farms on Mitchell Street is the third most populated Cumberland Farms in the state.
Oh, it's gonna be big too.
It's going to be big too, right there.
It's gonna be like the one up in Montville, I know that, so.
Okay. So that's the west side. Here's the east side. So that sort of looks like a scorpion, if you want to call that the scorpion. This one's sort of like the spider. So this one's much more large. This has 2 generators, which is down here by the town PAF. There's 2 generators, 2.5 megawatts each. And then right by us, by the Groton Utilities Operations Building, there are 2.5 generators, so totaling 10 megawatts. So the plan for this one is much larger. We propose to go straight up Pequannock Road and then tie into Long Hill Road feeder, and so feed this whole populace straight up Long Hill Road and Pequannock Road. And with a small tail at the end, which I think goes over to KHTC, the Kings Heights Technology Center, that's our stopping point. Along this line, directly across the street from Buddington Road is the Regency. You go up further and you've got the big wide plaza, which we've added, which is here. It's not highlighted here. We're going to add a section down on Tower Ave, which will allow us to feed the airport, all the airport hangars and AvCrad, et cetera, down here. And that will allow us now to also tie this during our normal circuit. Normally that area is fed from Trails Corner, which has no connection to the microgrid. But again, all these areas down here, a section of Drozdek Drive, which we're going to use a switching point along there, and then I think this is Laurelwood in here, but we're going to stop actually the first 2 connections. And then on the back side, we propose to go up Fort Hill to Newtown Road. At the intersection there is the library, the senior center, and further down the road is the Pequot Medical Center, and then further down is the Marriott and Pahegnet Road. So that's the plan right now, and I believe there's future to add some schools up here, potentially off of Fort Hill Road. So the potential is to add those at some point, which those would be maybe warming shelters or protection. So that's the proposed plan. We've actually worked with Schneider for about 2 months now, going through these designs. We've got engineers looking at the loading data, sending them our meteorology data so that they can figure out where the switching points. So they'll dynamically have to switch enough load to get the generators running, and then they'll have to add the load systematically. And that's what all these numbers on here are. These are all 3-phase or single-phase, what they call reclosers. So they allow them to shut and open to either shed load or to add load, essentially, to the circuits. So what we're looking for is endorsement from you guys to endorse the project, endorse us to go forward. So the way that it works is the DEEP has $3 million, up to $3 million for the town, city of Groton, and the USDA is offering another $2 million on top of that if they warrant it to be applicable and applicable to the region. So between Groton, Basra, and potentially Norwich, those are the 3 partners that we're working with to design this project. We'd be a regional hub essentially for the area, and people could come here during storms, et cetera, or major outages, which is, I believe, what happened last time. We had people from Massachusetts, Mystic, Old Lyme, East Lyme, all the way down to probably New Haven, coming here, eating Dunkin' Donuts and eating in all the restaurants, et cetera. So that's what I have. Any questions?
Dean?
Yeah, so the idea behind this is within these areas, within these networks, you have generation capacity?
That's correct.
Okay, and the idea behind the microgrid is to basically, in the event of a catastrophe, a larger grid going down, you would isolate this, what's now plugged into everything else. You'd be able to isolate it,
Correct.
And it can continue to function without being dragged down with everything else.
That's correct.
And I think Pfizer's already done this. They've, I think for their own purposes, decided that the way the currents runs, it could damage, the way the fluctuations damage just delicate instruments, et cetera. They've gone to a fuel cell. I think they may have pulled themselves altogether off the grid. So they're on their own little micro grid. But if this thing is established, would the current users experience anything, any fluctuations, any oscillations in the system?
That's a good question. So currently what happens, you would have noticed it, or someone in the town would have noticed it by now, we actually run those generators. There's 17.5 megawatts of generation, diesel generation now on all the circuits. Those are in place, and those are used for distribution load shedding. So what they do is when the system is reaching a peak for the system, it has a potential to generate a new ratchet for the system and cost us extra money. So if we go over our peak established from last year, we will now have to pay extra money because we've established a new peak, and that will stay with us for 1 year. C.O.W, who actually runs those distributed generators, runs those at least once a month to capture the peak and to eliminate that peak. So there's been no issues, no one's reported any issues, et cetera, and what happens is those are actually stabilized to the voltage of the system. Essentially they match our voltage on the system, and they just essentially shed the load and they take on some of that load. So they're already doing it. They're already doing much of that. Most people won't even know that it's not the utility, that it's the generators that are up, right? It'll be essentially the same thing. These are what they call Tier 4 generators. They're extremely low toxic output for them. They've got special scrubbers on them. That was a very large price of the actual cost of the generators.
So you're looking for a grant of how much? $3 million from the state?
What's that?
$3 million from the state, the grant.
So the grant, DEP has made available up to $3 million for municipal microgrids, and then USDA is also adding to that, which I think the money comes from the same exact place, but it's another $2 million on top of that. For certain areas, Groton's been identified as a USDA potential grant winner.
I thought the state was out of money. Where's the state coming up with all this money?
So this was allocated by DEP, I believe, at the beginning of the year, and they actually knocked it down a little bit. I think they took $5 million out, and now I think it's at 21 million. There's 21 million left.
So,
and it's a first come, first serve basis kind of thing.
One last question I've got. So you're either on grid or you're in what they call island mode.
Correct.
When the microgrid is established, will there be times, say once a month, once a quarter, once a year, when you sort of test the microgrid, basically isolated from the larger grid, and does that cause any disruptions or oscillations or anything? Right.
So the DEP requires, as part of the commissioning and the grant application, you have to design in a test methodology for testing the grid 4 hours once a year. So Schneider's actually working on that design, and what would happen is, because it's automated, what would potentially happen at night or at some point during the evening of probably a non-heating, non-cooling month, these isolation points would allow for disconnect. So what would happen is it might actually run the generators first like they do now, and then just switch off the disconnect points. So nobody would actually notice. You'd have tie switches in some areas to tie into the existing load, and then at those break points where the grid's been isolated, those will essentially open, and those customers will only be on the microgrid. The other customers will be on the regular power.
But if I have my lights on at that point, I'd see them do something?
You shouldn't. Not. No, you shouldn't. So what happened at the tie points, they've got what's called synchrophasers, and they'll actually synchronize with the generators. And then they have to do that in order to switch everything back on. So that's, at that point, you may see a small blip, but you wouldn't see that much. Okay. We essentially do that now.
So your position is basically that there are only pluses to this, and that there's no downside for the local consumers.
Right, so the major pluses we see from the utility standpoint is we get to now enhance the system, right? So all these switches, even though they're only there, I mean, they're part of the design for the microgrid. We can essentially use them now at any point. So any kind of major storm, we have a microburst, et cetera, and we have an isolation. Say this street goes out here, and we want to just isolate that street, that section. We've got now 2 switch points. We can open the switch here, open the switch here, using our SCADA system that's already in place, and now everybody else can be back on. We can just isolate the problem areas. And so that now leads into a potential for later on, 5-10 years down the road, with additional funding, potentially for the utility, self-healing grid, right? So now outages become shorter because the system can now open over here and close over here and feed those customers in this section from another location. So I think that's huge. The other one is we don't know what's going to happen the next storm. You know, we may have been lucky up until now, right? So what's nice about this section here, there aren't a lot of trees, right? The poles are up in the air, the wires are up in the air. There's not a lot of trees along Long Hill Road in Pequannock. So that seems like a relatively hardened area. Future plans for the utility, because of the microgrid, could be that we put all tree wire, right? Or harden a system, or something to that point. And especially down here, maybe we go all covered wire. So if it does fall, or it's called Hendrix, where it's grouped up together, if that were to fall to the ground, it's still insulated, right? So you wouldn't technically lose power, you would just have wires on the ground, where now they're open, bare. So there's potential for this to continue and make us all smarter and the system just better and better and better.
Thanks.
So, I might recap a couple things. So you're saying that there's this small pool of money, and it's a state grant?
It's a state grant, correct. It's
And,
DOE.
Basically whoever's in first will pretty much,
Right. Whoever's approved first will get the money, based
there
on their
any-
approval.
is there any part of this that Groton Utilities has to match the state?
No. Currently, it's 100% funded by DEEP, and what happens, there's a 30%, 70% pay schedule. At the award of the grant, Schneider would essentially bill Groton Utilities. Groton Utilities would pay 30% as they receive it from DEEP, and then at the completion and after commissioning. So there has to be there's an approval process that has to happen at the end, where Schneider has to actually prove and commission. DEEP has to witness it, and they have to have all their plans and I's and T's crossed, et cetera. At that point, there's a 70%. Schneider would bill Groton Utilities 70%, and the check would come from DEP and go to Schneider. But there's no necessity to match. Actually, you have to declare whether or not you're going to match or provide additional funds in the grant, and our plan right now is not to.
Okay, and did I get the impression that I have a general idea of where you're located, but is that blue line like a new section that you're actually?
Right, so we met with the town officials, Mayor Flax and Mr. Ofinger, and what they were mentioning was that the senior center is a warming center, and we had talked about the library as well, which I don't believe that's a shelter or not, but if it's on that line and it's fed there, it'll get as residual. And then the mention of was the school later on. The school would end up maybe being a shelter or a warming center. So we added that. That's actually part of the microgrid now. So it goes up Fort Hill Road to Newtown and it goes down. And actually it's going to be fed from the substation. So what's nice is we have SCADA now. We have automatic control from the control room at the operations center. We can actually open and close breakers. We're in the middle of commissioning and extending that out now. So we can actually open and close those breakers as part of the microgrid through the existing SCADA. And that feeder actually comes right from the station, would go down Newtown Road and feed these. We would shed the residential loads because those are considered not emergency loads.
Okay, and then, so you hired Schneider as a consultant?
Right, so there was a vetting process initially. The members of Norwich, Groton Utilities, Boswell Light Power, and CMEC had a process. We did a Kaizen, a KT process where we evaluated 4 vendors that actually submitted for their proposal to apply for the grant. So they were given a small stipend, essentially to get them to buy in with large risk. So they know that there's a lot of risk here. If they don't get the grant application, they don't move forward with anything. If they get the grant awarded to Groton Utilities or to the town in the Osra and Groton, they actually will be the selected engineering firm to move forward with the grant process. So we went through a process and actually selected them based on points of a scoring sheet, et cetera, with 3 other
I'm
companies.
just curious, how much are you paying Schneider as a consultant?
The $10,000. So it was $10,000, one fee of $10,000 split between Norwich, Groton Utilities, and Boswell Light Power.
Okay, and just lastly, so if the grant goes through, who manages the project?
Groton Utilities will manage the project.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that covered all my questions.
I do have one.
Go ahead, Harry.
Why not go right to the high school now? Because that's, we use that as a shelter.
Say that again?
Why don't you just go to the high school now? Because that is used more as a
So
shelter
the
than
high
any place.
school's not in our territory. We have a non-compete with Eversource. Right. So we do this feed here. If you look at, this is Gary Court area.
Okay.
Where there's 2 generators now. This is the town PAF, I believe. This stripe here actually goes up to El Grasso.
Okay.
Right,
Okay,
so
so we
eventually
really
I
do
think-
use our high school. I mean, when we had the Irene or whatever,
Right,
I
right.
remember buying all the Cheerios and cornflakes and taking them up there
Oh,
because
okay.
it was,
All right. That's good to know.
there was people, diabetics or something like that.
Oh, okay.
But, I had one other question. You said you're going to get your fuel
Yes,
in the west section from Hess. Where are you going to get it for the east section?
Hess.
Hess also, okay.
So right now, I believe CMEC has a partnership or a deal with, I think, East River Energy,
Yep.
which is, I think, New Haven. So the idea would be to try to secure that and work out a contract so that if we had to, we could
I mean, it's
maybe
really the
switch
only
it.
place around to get a lot of diesel fuel anyways, I think, so.
Correct. I think a lot of the Hess or Buckeye is actually storage for the government right now. So I don't know if they can switch and barter for location of fuels, et cetera.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
very much
very
for
much.
your questions.
Mark?
Yes.
When are you guys looking to get your application? And when do you need the letter of endorsement?
As soon as possible. So we hope to get the applications in by the end of December, which I think we still need letters from Basra Town and Lebanon. So that may push it back a little bit, but as soon as you guys are available. I think I sent you a copy of.
Yes, you sent us a
proposal.
draft.
Okay, all right.
Greatly appreciate it.
So however you guys want to edit that, and then
Yeah.
I think there's an affidavit as well that just says that the people that sent the letters are of the governing body of the town.
And do you, at this point, when you met with the mayor and myself, what I took away, I mean, I think this is a great project personally, but you mentioned that, you know, a lot of the system's already in place. This is going to allow you to buy switches, essentially, buy and install switches, hardware, software, whatever. We're fortunate that the generators are already here.
Right, that's a huge savings, because the generators, cost-wise, going into the microgrid, you're talking $1 million, probably a generator. And that would blow the whole grant right out of the water, and they won't pay for generators. So I think,
And what's the total, at this point, what do you think the total?
we don't even know. So Schneider's not released that, but I think one of the phone calls, they said it was pretty close. So I don't know if that means close to the 3 or close to the 5, but, you know, like you said, most of it is just the switch, it's the switch. I mean, luckily, this is the largest, as far as we know, the largest design having to do with the utility. Most of them are smaller. They are a school, a municipal building, and a fire department or something like that, and they put in a couple of generators and they tie them together. This is probably one of the largest they'll see, hopefully, you know, and so it may take longer for them to approve, et cetera.
And the generators that you have, as the council may recall, 2 of the generators we were involved in from the standpoint of allowing Groton Utilities and CMEC to place them down off of Gary Court. That was maybe 5 years ago, plus or minus.
Probably 7 years.
And they were, at the time, they were peaking generators, and I think that initially, at least, my recollection is, and it is probably wrong, is that was like just a 5-year, but you guys have extended.
Yeah,
What's
so it was a
the
5-year
life
project.
expectancy of
It
these
was
generators?
to get 50 megawatts, so it's not just here, we have 2 in Basra, I think there's 6 or 8 in Norwich, and the idea was to get 50 megawatts up and running in 5 years, and that was to do what you said, is actual peak shape. But the extent of the generators is probably 20, 25 years, that's what the expected life is,
Thank you.
so they're here to stay.
Greg?
Yeah, just one question. Without this system, what can we do now with those generators as far as emergency power?
So right now, they could be run what they call a black start, which means with no power, we could run the generators. But what we don't know is exactly where those loading locations are. We don't know where's 1.5 megawatts. We're not really
Right.
sure, right? So there's analysis and whatnot that has to go on to determine those points, and that's the stuff that Schneider's doing behind the scenes. They're actually determining, okay, there's 2 generators here, where's 1.5 megawatts of load in this area, this general area, to be able to start that generator. You have to load it at least 1.5 megawatts.
Right.
So they're going to determine that, and then what's the next switching point? And is the next switching point, you know, bring it up to 2 megawatts and then bring on the second generator, and then systematically throughout the whole startup. So it might take maybe an hour for everything to come on, but automating the whole system would be essentially to isolate and then to systematically bring the system up to where it needs to
All
be.
right, thanks.
Thank you. That's a great project. I mean, I think I appreciate the fact that it's, you know, you're looking at the whole community and making sure that we're almost a destination should there be
Right.
power issues in southeastern Connecticut. So it's a great project. Is there, we don't have to move on anything, right, Mark? We're just
Well, I think ultimately, we need.
a motion
We need a
to
motion
support
to
letter.
provide a letter of endorsement. Is it just simply a letter? Or
It's
do you
simply a
want
letter, right.
motion of
There's a
some-
letter, and I think the city did a resolution to provide support and endorsement to the project, essentially, the DEP.
So moved.
project.
Second.
So we have a motion and a second to provide that same support. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? That passes
Thank you very much.
6 to 0. Thank you.
I'll make a motion to
Randall, I know
adjourn.
you sent me the
Second.
draft letters. If you have a copy of what the city did in terms of a motion, if you could send it over, that would be great.
We're adjourned.
Thank you.